لله ثم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونتوب إليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهد الله فهو المهتد ومن يضلل فلن تجد له وليا مرشدا وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن سيدنا وحبيبنا ومولانا محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما. All praise is due to Allah, and after that all praise is due to Allah. We thank Him, we seek help from Him, we ask guidance in Him, and we seek forgiveness in Him from our own evils and from our own bad deeds. Anyone who has been guided by Allah, they will be guided. And anyone who has been misguided by Allah, you will never find a guardian to guide them. I bear witness. I bear witness that there is no deity worthy of worship except for Allah, the only one without partner. And I bear witness that Muhammad ﷺ is his servant and his messenger. Proceed forward. So, as most of you know, we've been talking about financial stewardship. How do ourselves as Muslims conduct our affairs in line with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's commandments when it comes to our finances. And so this is the third part, or the final part, in a three-part series that I was talking about so far. And we come to the last one. And so we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us to do certain things. And in Islam, it's not only about the ibadat, about the worship, but it's also about the mu'amalat, the everyday transactions and those type of things that are happening within our life. And all of those things were taught to us by our beloved messenger, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The sustenance we are provided with, the risk that we get from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is it's an amana upon us. It's a trust that's been placed upon us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we will be asked about it. We will be asked on the Day of Judgment exactly what we did with the money that we were given. And were we prudent with our money? Did we spend it in a wise way? Did we spend it in charity? Did we just waste it? Were we extravagant? Were we miserly? All of these things will be asked about. And that's where the idea of stewardship of your money is what I wanted to discuss in the past couple of weeks. Now these days, you hear many people talk about Muslims should not be having expensive things and they should be using the money rather instead for charitable works and those type of things. Now charity in Islam is something that's very, very important. In fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran many times that when you give in charity, He will return that in measure بِغَيْرِ حِسَابٍ. Without measurement, He's going to give back to you. So that has its place within Islam itself. However, that being said, the only people that I hear this from that say that you should be spending all of your money in charity and not buying anything, to be honest with you, are only the people that don't have any money. Because they don't understand what that reality is all about. The reality is when you have that money, it's much more difficult to give it away. If you don't have it, yeah, everybody's going to say that. So if I'm sitting as a pauper, living on the streets, I'm going to be like, yeah, this guy who, the Saudi, the sheikhs that are there, these people that are living in Damascus Heights, all these people, they should just sell their houses and give everything away. But it's easier said than done. Because that same person, when he gets into that situation, let's see how fast he gets rid of his house. It's not going to happen, because it's not a reality. And Islam is not about the unreal. It's about reality. We know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows us better than we know ourselves. And He knows exactly what we're going to do. So what He advocates is not an extreme of one or the other, but a middle way. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this in the Quran for as an ummah. We are what? We are a middle nation. Ummatun wasata. A middle nation. And what does this middle nation mean? It means that in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives a description of what that is. He says, وَالَّذِينَ إِذَا أَنفَقُوا لَمْ يُسْرِفُوا وَلَمْ يَقْتُرُوا وَكَانَ بَيْنَ ذَلِكَ قَوَامًا. He says that when you spend, you are neither extravagant, you don't just waste your money on things you don't need. You are neither extravagant, nor are you miserly, meaning you don't hold back on people that need from you. You don't hold back on your family. You don't hold back even upon yourself. You don't hold back. But you carry a middle way. You carry a middle way between the two. And that is something that is very, very important for us. So that was the first lesson, if you want to call it, about having good financial stewardship. That you're actually not on one extreme, which is the extravagant way, and on the other extreme, which is the miserly way. And so as we discussed last week then, we come to the second way, and that is that to be able to fulfill your desires of wanting things in this world that you neither can afford nor that you need, what most people end up doing is they end up getting into debt. And the second part of this is that debt is an unnecessary evil, meaning you should avoid this as much as possible. And only if it's a necessity should you be getting involved with debt. Because debt is an oppressive tool. It's an oppressive tool, and it is something that makes people lie, it makes people cheat, it makes people do things that they normally would not do. It actually also, the scholars have said, it actually comes in between you and your worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because rather than asking, your mind will be completely consumed with how is it you're going to pay off the debt? How is it, what are you going to tell your lender exactly why is it you can't pay off the debt? And you're going to do that in your prayer, you're going to do that, you're going to take it out on your family, you're going to do all these different things. And so that is why in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, as related by Aisha radiallahu anha, he used to make a dua in the prayer. And he used to say, Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-ma'tham wal-maghrab. Oh Allah, I seek refuge in you from sins and debts. And so the companions asked him, and they said, why is it, oh Ya Rasulullah, why is it that you seek refuge from debts so often? And the Prophet ﷺ, I've gone over this in my previous book, the Prophet ﷺ, he responded back, he said, because when a man gets into debt, when he speaks, he tells lies. And when he makes a promise, he breaks it. How many times do we ourselves or people we know, when they are into debt, even if it's not a bank loan for $1 million, even if it's $100 or so that you're 100 ringgit or so that you're borrowing, how many times is it that you see yourself or see other people be like, oh, I remember this debt, I'm going to pay you back. I promise you, by the next time I get my paycheck or something happens, I'm going to pay you back. And most of the time, that's not going to happen. And so what you end up doing is, you end up being in a lifestyle, all you are consumed with is that when you're speaking, you're telling lies, and when you're making a promise, you're actually breaking them. So this idea of debt, again, I want to be very, very clear here. It is not something that is haram. It is not forbidden in Islam. It is something that is acceptable, however, it's acceptable in cases of necessity. If you need to borrow money to be able to pay for your food at night, acceptable. If you need to borrow money to buy that 10th car, or that house that has the 5th bedroom that you probably will never use, unnecessary. You see where I'm going? A lot of people say, well, what about student debt? That's very important as well, because I need to be able to get a good education. So I've actually noticed how college students live, because I used to be one not too long ago. Now, as a college student, most people end up being in debt because of a lifestyle choice. It's not because they need to pay for their tuition. It's not because they need food on the table. They do it because they want to leave the same lifestyle they were leaving at home when they go to college. So they want their 2-bedroom apartment, they want their clothes that they used to wear, and more of them, they need a car, they need all of these things. So even if you're getting into a college debt, which from a distance it looks like, yeah, that's pretty necessary, what you realize is that most people end up getting into that debt for unnecessary reasons. To be able to fund a lifestyle which they don't need, and likely they don't deserve. And why do I say they don't deserve it? Because if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted you to have that, He would have given you the risk for it. He would have given you the risk for it to be able to have it without getting into loans. But He didn't. So we're basically having to borrow from the future to be able to pay for the present, for things we don't need with money we don't have. So that's the whole cycle that you get into when we get into debt. Now finally, I come to the last part, which is the, if you want to call it, the exact opposite of debt. The exact opposite of debt. And that is, living within our means also means that we put some money aside as a savings for the things that are going to come in the future. Things we don't know about. In America, they call them the rainy day fund. Right? The day that it rains, the day your car breaks down, the day that your roof leaks and you need to spend money. All of those things, those are called a rainy day fund. Things you need to be able to spend money on. It wasn't planned, it wasn't expected, but you end up having to do it anyway. And those are the things that we have to do to be able to set some money aside. But there's a misperception what I find with a lot of people, and this is unfortunately something also that people unrightfully, I think, stress upon, is that they think that we should, as Muslims, always be living a poor lifestyle. And only the poor end up in heaven, and everybody else has to crawl themselves into heaven if they're rich. That's not, I mean, it's not what Islam is about. And in fact, as I mentioned to you last time, when it comes to actually being extravagant, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah An'am, in verse 141, he actually mentions, he says in there, he says that Allah, verily He, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, does not like those who are extravagant, those who are musrifin, basically they spend unnecessarily. And Ibn Kathir, in his tafsir of this ayah, he mentions this. He says this particular ayah was related because of a companion whose name was Thabit ibn Qais bin Shamas. Now what Thabit did was he decided that after he had picked all of the fruit from the date fruit from the trees, he was going to sit there and whoever walked by, he was going to give them the dates. And when the people stopped coming, whatever he had left, he was going to keep for himself. And so he did that all day, and by the evening came, all of the dates were gone and he had nothing left. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed this ayah. This is Ibn Kathir. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed this ayah mentioning, right, that Allah does not love like those who are the Muslimin, the ones that are extravagant. So this was in the case of charity. Imagine what it would be like if you were not in charity, it was something that you were doing to be able to fund an unwarranted lifestyle, to be able to do that. So we either don't save money at all, or of those of us that actually do end up feeling guilty about why it is that we're actually saving. And there's nothing wrong, as I mentioned, about being able to save money. The Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam in a hadith, he says, may Allah have mercy on a man. Now there's three conditions to this. May Allah have mercy on a man who earned money in a halal way. Earned money in a permissible way. The step number two is that he spent it economically. What does that mean? وَبَيْنَ ذَلِكَ قَوَامًا. That a middle way between the two. So you earn it in a halal way, not getting, right, not CIMB or RHB or anything along those lines. You can't work for them earning a halal provision. They're conventional banks. So you work in a halal way, you earn that money, you spend it economically, وَبَيْنَ ذَلِكَ قَوَامًا, and then neither extravagant nor miserly. And the last one that the Prophet ﷺ mentions, he said, I used some of the surplus for a day when he needed it. Use some of the surplus for a day when he needed it. Now this hadith assumes there is a surplus. Most of us are living without a surplus. Most of us are living day to day, month to month, without having any savings whatsoever. And so that's what the Prophet ﷺ here is talking about, especially living in today's world, when you have to save money for a possible job loss, maybe going for Hajj or for your children's education, medical bills that are coming up, taking care of your parents, all of this thing. There's so many things that can leave us either dependent upon our community or in debt for the rest of our lives. It becomes very, very essential for us to be able to save money. Now, interestingly enough, there's a book that was written by a professor whose name was Abhijit Banerjee. He wrote a book called Poor Economics. Now, Poor Economics is a book that actually he gets into the psychology of poor people and how is it that they can never get out of the cycle of debt. And one of the things that he mentions about poor people, they actually studied this in Indonesia, but he also did studies in India, in Africa, and other places as well. But in particular, he uses this example in India, and he said that the community and the family is so strong in Indonesia that if anybody gets into trouble, then the whole family bails them out. So if, for example, if my grandmother on my wife's side's cousins removed twice over had a heart attack, then everybody in the family, including myself, would be obligated to be able to pay, which is a great thing. Right? But what he mentions is that because nobody over there has any savings, the little that they have, as soon as they give that away, they're succumbed to be able to be in problems themselves. So the entire community gets dragged down because nobody has any savings because they're constantly spending it on emergencies that they should have saved for in the first place. Now, what is the lesson here? It is my obligation, very clear, it is our obligation as Muslims that when we see a person in need, beginning to be in trouble, something happened, a rain, a car broke down, something happened, and medical bills, whatever it is our obligation to be able to help them. However, it's a two-way street. And the way back is, it is their obligation to make sure they're never in need. That is their obligation, to be able to save money so they won't be asking their family members, to be asking their community, to be able to put their community in a situation where the entire community becomes oppressed by poverty because of somebody's mistake of not being able to save. That is something that is a communal obligation that everybody has. Oh Allah, we ask you to save us from being of those that become a burden on our families and our communities. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر لكم واستغفر. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. So before I begin on my second khutbah, I'll make my regular second khutbah announcement. There are people standing in the back. It might actually rain, so if there is space in front of you, please take that space so that somebody else can fill in the back rows, and everybody will have a place to sit. So the second part of the khutbah, we talked about now the three aspects of financial stewardship. Right, the first one being carrying a middle way when it comes to your finances, your expenses, your dealings, that type of thing. Staying out of debt at all times, unless in cases of necessity. And now we're on the third one, which is to be able to save money for a rainy day. Now, interestingly enough, you know, all of us read the Quran day in and day out. And we read the same ayat or the verses day in and day out. But it's really interesting to find is that whenever you're thinking about a certain topic, don't you ever find that the same ayat or the verses that you read stand out and shout towards you in certain ways that you never thought that was possible? So that's what happened to me in two stories of the Quran that I want to relate to you right now. I never thought of these cases in this way until I actually was thinking about this topic, and then I was reading these ayats and you're like, oh, that's right. It does make sense for this to happen. So the first one actually talks about this idea of saving for a rainy day. And that could be on an individual level, it could be on a community level, it can also be on a state or national level as well. And we have in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, we have in the story of Joseph a clear example of what you have to do when you have money, and what you have to do when you don't. Because why is that? So when Yusuf alayhi salam, when he comes out of prison, and he becomes appointed as the, let's call it the Minister of Treasury, right? Minister of Finance, Treasury Secretary, whatever that would be. What does he do? He said, what is the dream interpretation that he has for the king? He said, you are going to have 7 years of bounty. The crops are going to be everywhere. Everybody's going to be healthy. Everybody's going to be fine. But then after that, we're going to have 7 years of drought. That's where the 7 lean cows were eating the 7 fat cows. So we're basically going to have 7 lean years. So it's like an economic recession, or maybe even an economic depression. And so what does Yusuf do? Now he understands that if he left it for anybody else, they would not be able to do this. So he says what? He says, make me the Minister of Treasury. Make me in charge of the granary. I'll take care of it. And so what he does is that for 7 years when there is bounty in the land, he saves in the granary. He gives it up and he saves some. And then when the drought comes, there's enough in the granary so that he can give it out to people when they don't have anything. Now how do we know this? Because the brothers came. His brothers came to the city asking for the granary so that they could go back and be able to plant the things they needed to plant. Right? And so we know this is as an example. So in today's modern age, when people in good times borrow money to spend money, and then in bad times borrow more money to spend money, and that could be on a national level, it could be community, it could be individual. And you have that, we have clear examples in the Quran of how in the good times we're supposed to be saving money. And in the bad times, be able to use that savings that we have not to be a burden on the community, right? The concept of borrowing money as a nation state is not something that's new. People used to fund their wars back in the olden days by borrowing money from different countries. It was happening during the time of Yusuf alayhi salam as well. He could have done that also. He could have basically just partied for the 7 years, and then when the 7-year drought came, he could have just gone and borrowed money from other people, but he didn't. And that's the example that we have. Number two, the example that we have is for the savings that we have to do for our children, and more importantly, for the next generation. Now this one was a very interesting one, because we read these ayat, inshallah, every single week when we read Surah Kahf. And the story is in Surah Kahf is about Khidr and Musa. So I'm not going to go through the whole story because it's a very long one, most people know it. I'll just talk about one specific set of verses in the Quran, in the story of Khidr. Now Khidr and Musa, when they go to a certain town, they ask for money, or they ask for food and for shelter, and then they don't give it to them. So as they're walking out of that town, Khidr notices that there's a wall and it's falling down. And so he builds up that wall again. And then Musa turns to Khidr and says, why did you build that wall? Or even if you did, you could have asked for compensation from the people for building that wall. And so then basically Khidr says, this is the parting of our ways. Let me explain to you what happened. In this particular case, what does Khidr tell Musa? He said that underneath this wall was a treasure that belonged to a righteous man, two orphans whose father was a righteous man. Right? Underneath this wall was a treasure that belonged to two orphans whose father was a righteous man. And I didn't want if the wall kept crumbling, that I didn't want the townspeople to figure out there's a treasure there and then come raid it. So he built up the wall so to be able to hide it, so when the orphans grew of age, they could have access to it. Saving for the future. Saving for the next generation. Right? This is what this story is actually talking about. And so it's equally important to us to be able to look at this story and be able to glean that lesson that, first of all, the person that did this was a righteous man. What did I say about a righteous man? The Prophet said, he spends the money, he earns it in a halal way, he spends it economically, and then he saves a certain amount of money for when he needs it. And in this particular case, he saved it for his next generation. Right? That's the lesson in this for us, that we need to be able to have enough saving to be able to pass on to our next generation when it comes to that. So we should remember the two parts about the saving money as a recap. One is to earn it in a halal way, and the second one is that we have to invest it in a halal way. Now, at that time, during the time of Khidr or that righteous man, the only way they knew how to save was to be able to bury the treasure. I'm not asking you to go back to your backyards and bury that treasure. If you do, let me know your address after the khutbah. But what I am saying is that there are halal ways, especially in Malaysia, to be able to make those savings, those investments, and those type of things. Now, in Malaysia, obviously, we have this great enterprise called the Employee Provident Fund. Right? That's a guaranteed kind of savings that most Malaysians have. But you know what's really interesting is that when I first came about 5 years ago to Malaysia, right, it's a Muslim country, I had heard all of the great things about the Islamic finance that we're doing. And then I realized, wait a minute, how come the EPF, which is the largest fund in Malaysia, doesn't have a halal option for the Muslims? It didn't make any sense. But no matter, because now, in about 6 months to a year from now, you are going to have that option. And then you have no excuse for why you would choose a conventional over an Islamic. Because even your savings now can be something that you could do for savings in a halal way as well. Now, finally, when it comes to this topic of finance and those type of things, when it comes to debt and savings, I do want to mention one hadith. I've mentioned this before, but it is important for us to be able to kind of reflect upon it again when it comes to this topic. And that is the story of Abu Umama, who's sitting in the masjid. The Prophet comes to him and he says, Ya Abu Umama, why is it that you're in the masjid when it's not even time for the prayer? And Abu Umama, he looks at the Prophet ﷺ and he says, worries and debts, Ya Rasulullah. I have worries and I have debts that I have outstanding. And then the Prophet ﷺ, he said back to me, he says, Ya Abu Umama, should I not tell you something that you can say, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take away your debts, or take away your worries and pay off your debts for you? And Abu Umama said, yes, Ya Rasulullah, what is this? He says in the morning and in the evening, recite, Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-hammi wal-hazan, wa na'udhu bika min al-ajli wal-kasal, wa a'udhu bika min al-jubni wal-bukhl, wa na'udhu bika min al-ghalabati ad-dayn wa qahr al-rijal. He says, oh Allah, I seek refuge in you from worries and grief. I seek refuge in you from incapacity and laziness. I seek refuge in you from cowardice and miserliness. And I seek refuge in you from being heavily in debt and being overcome by men. Abu Umama says later on, as he's talking about this hadith, he said, I did that. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took away my worries and He paid off my debts. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is, He's the answerer of du'as. He's the one that's the reliever of all of the worries that we have. So if we have a worry, ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's going to give you in ways you don't know. But when it comes to this, one time I gave the khutbah, and I said this, and I didn't give the explanation, and somebody came up to me and said, brother, you should really explain what you meant by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala take care of the debts. Because then most people will be like, I'll just in the masjid and I'll just pray and maybe the sky will open up and a bag of money will just fall down onto my lap. Or I'll go to the ATM machine and I'll punch in my code and all of a sudden there's a couple of more zeros next to my $2 or 2 ringgit balance that I had. That's not what happens. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what He does, He's going to open up doors of risk that you didn't know you had ways of being able to have. And then it's our responsibility to be able to open up that door and to be able to walk in. We cannot be sitting in the masjid just praying for it. We have to go out there and seek the risk, the sustenance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has provided for us. And the second part of it is, as soon as you get that risk, there's going to be a temptation from shaitan. And that shaitan temptation is going to be, oh, you can pay off that balance in 1 month. You need a new car, your wife needs new clothes or jewelry, your kids need this, you need this, all of these different things. And before you know it, if you listen to that temptation, all of the money's going to be gone. And so what we have to do, our part is to not only seek out that risk, but remember the dua that we made, that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us that risk to be able to pay off those debts, then that is exactly what we are going to do. That is exactly what we are going to do. Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-ma'tham wal-maghrab. اللهم إني أعوذ بك من الهم والحزن ونعوذ بك من العجز والكسل ونعوذ بك من الجبن والبخل ونعوذ بك من غلبة الدين وقهر الرجال. O Allah, make us good financial stewards in this life according to your way. O Allah, give us the good in this life, the good in the hereafter, and protect us from the fire. O Allah, we ask you to have mercy on us at all times, especially if we're going through some type of hardship, be it financial or otherwise, and to protect us from any type of hardship that we might face, and to give us patience if we are to be able to face it. All the guide our leaders to the straight path. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم بارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. وأقم الصلاة.